Pakhuis de Zwijger. Al meer dan 15 jaar dé plek om elkaar te ontmoeten. Met gemiddeld 600 programma's per jaar geven wij ruimte voor het uitwisselen van ideeën. Zo kunnen we elkaar inspireren, verbinden we verschillende initiatieven en geven we kennis aan elkaar door. Met onze programma's gaan we dagelijks in gesprek over stad en land van morgen. We zoeken naar een inclusieve en rechtvaardige stad. Maar ook naar een stad die groen en klimaatneutraal is. Van creativiteit tot ruimtelijke ontwikkeling. Samen werken we aan een leefbare toekomst voor alles en iedereen. Daarom zijn onze programma's gratis. En dat blijven ze. Maar dit kunnen wij niet zonder jouw bijdrage. Steun ons daarom met een maandelijkse, jaarlijkse of eenmalige donatie. Word vriend van Pakhuis de Zwijger.
Well, thank you very much. I've been working here for a couple of years now. This is the first time I get an applause arriving on stage. That's promising for tonight, Tim. That's a good thing. Great, you all made the effort to come here tonight in quite a special episode in our series about tipping points, organized by Pakhuis de Zwijger, together with Scientist Rebellion. And I say, well, it's a special evening, and that's because we're very, very pleased with the guests we were able to invite tonight. Of course, we're always pleased with the guests we're having here, but tonight maybe a little bit extra because, well, when we talk about the series about tipping points, you could say, maybe you don't feel comfortable with it, Tim, but the godfather of the tipping point theory is here tonight to share a tiny bit of his knowledge with him. And he's accompanied by, well, a really fantastic musician, Jannes Ra is here tonight, and also by a scientist, and also one of the initiators of this series, Nina Hertog. So it's a promising night, I guess. Just to check, who joined us on previous evenings on tipping points? Okay, well, quite some people, but also some people that are here for the first time. And just to check, when I mentioned tipping points, climate tipping points, are there people that really have no idea what we're talking about? That's just good to know. No, okay, perfect. Oh, I don't believe, I've seen you before, so I think you might know what we're talking about, but Professor Lenton will focus on that, so you'll be fine. I'm briefly going to summarize what we've been talking before the previous evenings. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do right now. The first night we kicked off with the melting polar ice and the meters and meters of sea level rising that would cause. We moved on to the disruption of the AMOC, or the Gulf Stream, the extreme temperature fluctuations that would cause. We talked about deforestation and drought in the Amazon rainforest. We talked about greenhouse gases released by rapidly thawing permafrost. And most recently, we talked about, well, dying coral reefs. Yeah, no small potatoes. It's also quite heavy, I know, but each night we also focused on social tipping points, things that, well, could bring hope, and that's also something we're going to do tonight. From climate lawsuits to banning fossil ads, and about how we can use indigenous wisdom to save all our ecosystems. Each episode, and that's very important, shows us the crisis is real, but so is our power to change the course of the story, if we act fast. So that's something to keep in mind, and that's what we try to reach every evening on Tipping Points. And that's what we're going to do tonight with Professor Tim Lenton. We invited him to teach us how to tilt towards hope. And it's quite unique he's here. He has a lot to share with us. He's professor of climate change and earth system science at the University of Exeter. He published a lot of books on climate change, on ecological tipping points, both as social tipping points. So he's the man to teach us. Are you ready, Tim? Yeah? Well, please give him a big applause, Tim Lenton. You make it yourself comfortable.
I will do. I will do when I get.
When you get tired, you can just have a little.
Yeah, that's my prop.
Yeah, it's really, really nice. In preparation for this evening, I watched an interview with you. It was in 2013, so it's obviously not your first time in the Netherlands. You've been telling your story more often here. Can you tell something a bit? How do you think we, or the Dutch, look at climate change, the climate crisis, how we behave, how we act? What do you think?
Well, I look forward to hearing from you all how your views on that, but I can tell you from over the North Sea, I look across and I'm quite impressed by the fact that you have the most solar energy per person of anywhere in Europe.
So that's positive.
And also you're practical people used to fixing the holes in the dikes, maintaining the dikes, and you've applied that practicality to the energy transformation and just got on with it as far as I can see. Well, maybe things are changing now, but on my side of the North Sea, there's a lot more kind of backlash or stalling or whatever. Here, the net metering, the fact that you were able to sell your solar panels on your roof, the electricity back to the grid, that's really helped make you the solar leaders of Europe. And I like the way the Dutch have just got on with it. We don't have a lot of land, so let's put the solar panels up on stilts and keep farming underneath, or let's put photovoltaics, as they're called, on the inland seas and the reservoirs. That's exciting. That's innovation that the rest of the world's learning from.
All right, it's clear. You keep the positive eye.
I do, yeah.
Perfect. Thanks very much
Cool.
already for you to be here, and well, the stage is yours.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks everybody. Yeah, I thought try not to dwell too much on the bad climate tipping points. It sounds like you've had a few evenings of that if you've been to the series. But I want to just talk about the concept of a tipping point, so we get that first. And well, the chairs are attached together, so you probably can't lean back on your chair without causing everybody else in the row to fall over. But everybody's played this game at some point, where if you lean back on a chair, you get to a kind of a balance point where a little nudge one way or the other, you might end up back in what us scientists call a stable state of being upright and comfortable, but you might take a tiny little nudge the other way, and then you end up in a different stable state, sprawled on your back on the floor, and it's quite hard to get out of one stable state into the other. I'm going to show you a movie of something that's a little bit different, but it's me forcing a system towards a tipping point. And in the movie, we have the stable state on the left, that could be chair upright, and we have the other stable state on the right. But it's a bit different because it's as if I'd taken a blowtorch to the back legs of the chair and was slowly melting them, so that being upright is getting less and less stable until at some point it's going to lose all stability, and the only option is to tip into the other state. And at that point, the change was quite fast and self-propelling. Now, whenever us scientist types draw the valley, it's like saying, well, there's some balancing feedbacks, we call them, that want to maintain the status quo. But crucially, before a tipping point, they're getting weaker, whatever they are, and some other, what we call amplifiers or amplifying feedbacks in the system are getting stronger. The balance is shifting, and at the tipping point, the amplification takes over, and it's strong enough that I could switch the blowtorch off, but the tipping point would continue. The system moves under its own momentum. So that's kind of the crux about how tipping happens in a range of complex systems. And I'm going to talk a bit about the climate first, but then we'll get on to the tipping that we need in our economic systems, in our energy systems, and the rest of it. But perhaps we were all aware that something strange is going on in the climate. And in fact, the last year and a half or two have been really unusually hot. And I mean, so unusual that me and my scientific colleagues don't really have an agreed explanation. So it's the last bit of the little dotted orange wiggling here. This is pretty unprecedented high temperatures links. But you also see here, we're already heading towards the fabled 1.5 degrees centigrade of global warming above the pre-industrial level, basically in 2030, at the end of the decade. So we're seeing more rapid change than we were expecting. We can't actually explain the recent anomaly. We hope it's going to come back. It's clear that there's some loss of stability in the system, some melting of the back legs of the chair, if you like. And I've spent 2 decades now kind of quiet, in my little English way, quietly trying to tell the world that this is a serious set of risks, that there are big bits of the climate system that are like the chair. They've got 2 different stable states, but what we're doing to warm the world up could tip them from one state to another, and that tipping in almost all cases would be bad. And just like any other complex system, like the human body, for example, if you tip one bit of the system, like you had a failure in one organ, it will have ramifications for other bits of the system. And that's why I drew some arrows on this diagram showing some of the, we would say, causal connections. And we begin to see those as well. So there's a few notes on the figure telling you about the fact that change is accelerating in the wrong direction in these crucial bits of the planet we know could be tipped. But also the arrows are hinting that changes in one part of the planet are causing consequences that can bring forward tipping in another part. So there's the Arctic's warming up about 4 times as fast as the planet on average, which is in itself remarkable, because we're replacing a really reflective ice white surface with a dark blue ocean. That means it doesn't just get warmer there, there's more precipitation. So there's more fresh water in the Arctic, and there's more melting of the Greenland ice sheet. All that fresh water pours into the Atlantic Ocean. It basically disrupts the process. The water sinks from the top of the ocean to the bottom, either side of Greenland. That drives this thing called the great overturning circulation of the Atlantic. That's weakening. If that thing tips, we're all going to know about it, and it's going to have repercussions down for accelerating the melt of the ice sheets around Antarctica, because it's going to leave heat behind in the Southern Ocean, warm things up there. This is perhaps the biggest tipping point in the climate, or the one we'd be most afraid of. I'll talk about why briefly in a second, but I just wanted to summarize the 20 years or so that I've been studying on this. As a bunch of climate scientists, we write these fabled assessment reports, and we summarize with this, what we call burning embers diagram, where do we think these bad tipping points in the climate become, a serious risk in terms of high likelihood. Well, the answer used to be we thought it would take 4 or 5 degrees C of global warming before this was kind of high likelihood bad consequences. But as you can see, every time we reassess this, we get more knowledge. Unfortunately, things look riskier than they did. And now, as a scientific community, we've been concluding for a while, actually, that we're already in the danger zone where these are not high-impact, low-likelihood events. They're already becoming high-impact, relatively higher likelihood events. And that's a sobering assessment, particularly if the really big one I mentioned, that Atlantic overturning circulation, was to collapse. This was some simple calculations we did. We took a model scenario where it collapses, and we ran that climate model output, if you like, into a standard model of crops, like major staple crops like wheat and maize, and looked to see whether it got better or worse to grow wheat and maize around the world. And purple is getting worse, green is getting better. Dark purple means eliminating the potential to grow these crops. There's a few places, if you lived, no one does, but if you're a penguin, you're happy because you can start growing wheat in Antarctica. But almost everywhere is purple and dark purple in places. And in fact, globally, if this tipping point happens on top of global warming, if we calculate the area to grow these major staple crops is more than halved. So in simple terms, it'd be a food and also a water security crisis. That's why these are events we desperately ought to be working our hardest to avoid. Enough of the bad news then, because I think we're all keyed into that. And I think we kind of know what we need to do, because we've been told by people like me often enough that the only way you stop global warming is to stop the emissions of the greenhouse gases that cause it. So you've got to stop all fossil fuel burning, and then the other emissions links to food and diet choices that we'll get onto later this evening. And the thing is, we're just not going fast enough at doing that. We are making some progress, but in kind of nerdy language, we talk about decarbonizing the economy, so eliminating the emissions associated with economic activity or productivity. We're doing a little bit of that, but we're doing it about at least 7 times too slowly. And trying to go 7 times faster is hard in any activity. And my proposition is the only way we could credibly believe we could speed up that much is if I could convince you there are what I'm going to call positive tipping points, where the changes in behavior and technology that we need to get to zero emissions could become self-accelerating or self-propelling. So we'd have to believe, you know, the economy, society's in an unstable state. I think we can agree, unsustainable state. I think we can agree on that. We can definitely imagine a world which is powered by renewable energy and electrified and everything else. But there's some barrier clearly in between them. And there's definitely a lot of what I'd call them damping feedbacks, like perverse subsidies for fossil fuel extraction, for example, that are maintaining the status quo here. But I want to argue that there are actions that can destabilize the current unsustainable state of things and shift the balances of feedback towards the things that could amplify change in a good direction, such that conceptually we could see cases where we can tip from the old fossil way of doing things to the clean way of doing things. And I'll try and show you a few examples that it's actually happening, at least at national scales for really important sectors of activity that are responsible for a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. But the overriding theme is one of, can society change fast? And to convince you that it can change fast and it can change fundamentally, and the actions of a very few people can change things for everybody, I like to use my relative here, Tim Lenton. So she was a kind of a distant cousin, if you like, great aunt in a way. She's photographed in 1913 here in prison, in Holloway Prison in London. You can tell that by the number on her jacket. And you might be able to guess why she was in prison in 1913 if you know a bit of British social history. She was a suffragette, one of the Women's Social and Political Union, and she'd just been caught red-handed burning down the tea house in Kew Gardens with her accomplice, Olive Warry. And actually, Lillian's stated aim anyway was to burn at least one building a week to try and demonstrate to the then government that you can't continue to govern without the consent of half of the governed, the female half of the population, right? But like all suffragettes, the standard practice, you get caught, you're in prison, you go straight on hunger strike. What was the standard practice of the authorities in response? Very quickly to force feed you. Put a tube down into your stomach, pour liquid food in so you don't starve yourself to death, and it's embarrassing. Well, what happened to Lillian on this particular occasion, they put the tube down the wrong way into one of her lungs, poured liquid food into her lungs, and nearly drowned her. Took, by the accounts that you can find in the National Archives, say 7 people had to restrain her. But then what happened, the authorities discreetly released Lillian from prison to the care of her friends to try and recuperate. But the Home Secretary at the time, a man called Reginald McKenna, lied about what had happened and said, oh, we've released her from prison, but she's just unwell because she went on hunger strike. And then there was a massive national uproar, actually. People were writing to the Times of London, famous surgeons saying, this is ludicrous, the government's lying. This was one of many events in a long struggle that started to shift public opinion away from opposition to this militant minority that were burning buildings and whatever else, and brought some empathy and sympathy with the cause. Of course, it didn't immediately tip change, but as I think you all know, eventually the actions of a brave few transformed our democracy. I say our, because this spread, of course, to many nations. So, tipping can happen fast, and it has a kind of amplifying feedback in it. And it's demonstrated again by this Fridays for Future movement, for example. So when Greta Thunberg chooses to skip school on a Friday to protest the Swedish government to do more on climate change, she's breaking from social norms, right? Which is your parents and the state and everybody else tells you should go to school on Fridays. You should not be sat outside Parliament. But she's doing that because she's trying to trigger a wider tipping in social norms so we take action on climate change more seriously. And crucially, whenever anybody steps out of the social norm, they're usually vilified, at least by the right-wing media in this case, and Greta certainly was, because that's the whole point of social norms. We're supposed to conform, and there'll be some punishment for not conforming. But crucially, by breaking from social norms, Greta makes it incrementally easier for the next person who agrees with her cause to skip school as well and join her. Now, initially, that doesn't You don't see too many people. This is a photo about 2 or 3 weeks into the protest. You don't see too many people sat with her, but there's a few. But crucially, every week, the number of protesters doubled by my rough estimation. So how many protesters will you have if you double the number of protesters for 20 weeks, do you think? You get 1 million, basically, and that's pretty much what happened. Although it slows down, it follows what's called an S-curve, so it's sort of the exponential growth starts to slow, but sure enough, there were millions of protesters, certainly about 6 months later. And of course, there were then declarations of climate and ecological emergency by governments, the UK, and then one of the last to declare here is the European Parliament, a little over a year after the start of the protest, declaring a climate and ecological emergency. This is good news. This is, if you actually read those things, you'll see it means the governments are saying, our policies are not up to the task here, we need to do something different. That's crucial. But of course, rhetoric, political or otherwise, doesn't change the greenhouse gas emissions, which is the only thing the climate can feel. So this is great progress, but we need to also believe the behaviors and the technologies that are causing the problem can change fast. So briefly, I want to go back into history in a second to convince you that as well we can tip quickly in those terms. Before I go there, let's talk more generally about this, what I mentioned for Greta. She kind of, her ideas, if you like, you could almost say they infected others, or they found compatriots who shared those views, and that the idea of joining a skipping from school protest spread through a population, through something that we talk about more generally as researchers, as a process of social contagion, to give it the feeling of like a viral spread. A social contagion is also happening for some of the technologies we need. And putting solar panels on your roof, which we also already mentioned, has got direct evidence that we look at what our neighbor's doing, we ask them, oh, you put those solar panels on, how's it going? You know, does it work? Are you making any money selling your electricity back to the grid? And that can often encourage us to adopt. Well, this is a little movie from the mid-2010s, from somewhere in Colorado, and it might not show brilliantly, but you can kind of see the first-time customers in yellowy orange, and then the referrals by a friend who are kind of adopting in this viral way. And I've got lots of other movies I could show you of this happening in all kinds of geographies, and sure enough, it's clustered, the social influence is there, it's one of the amplifiers that can make the change self-propelling. Right, that's just recently. But we want to know that we can change technology fundamentally and fast. So the most famous example, the one I'm going to show you, this is a photograph of the Easter Parade in New York City, Fifth Avenue, so the posh bit of Manhattan. This is the year 1900, and everybody comes out on the sidewalk, as you'd call it over there, in their finery, but also they're kind of parading on the street in their favorite mode of transport, a horse and carriage, bar one person in an early automobile. Can you see the person in an automobile, or car, as we'd say, over there? 13 years later, I'll show you a photograph of Easter Parade, Fifth Avenue, New York City, from the archives. Spot the person in the horse-drawn carriage. Everybody else is driving an early automobile. Can you see them? Same place, roughly, in the street over here, coming towards us. But that's the tipping point in what personal mobility that happens in a decade. And okay, it starts in the cities and among the rich, but it rapidly spreads to the middle classes, to the countryside, and eventually to everybody, right? And it's pretty quick. And what's going on? I mean, loads of stuff's going on, and we don't have time to talk about all of it, but there's a bunch of amplifying feedbacks here. There is a kind of fad or fashion going on. People like look at the other people with their cars and go, I want one of those. But then there's really important feedbacks, like the more cars you make, the better you get at making them, and the cheaper they get. So that's like, we call that learning by doing and economies of scale. A famous example of economies of scale is the Model T Ford, and there's probably some in the photos, and car experts will tell me which of these, several of these I think are probably Model Ts, but the price of a Model T Ford, between it first coming on the market, I think it was 1908, it drops in price from nearly $1,000 by 1913 or so, it's dropped in price to something like $260. So that's economies of scale. Wow. Also, one technology sometimes is combined with another technology in a way they reinforce. Of course, with all these new cars, you needed gas stations, pumping stations to fill them up in. So there's a kind of feedback between technologies there. But also, the electric starter motor came out of early electric cars and was put on the early gasoline cars. Took away one of the only disadvantages of the gasoline car, which was a pain to start. You had to crank a handle, and then the gasoline car takes over. Not good news from a climate point of view, but super interesting to know that somewhere in that transition I showed you, there was a time where about 30 or 40% of the cars were actually electric. So it actually took until when? Well, to get the final tipping point to the electric car, it happened first in Norway, and it took another century, apparently. But here's the data for how, just recently, Norway's car market has tipped completely to electric vehicles. Why Norway? Why is Norway ahead of everybody else in the world? And by the way, this matters. I mean, cars aren't perfect and electric cars aren't perfect, but road transport is about 12% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, and it's a much bigger fraction in richer countries. So tipping to electric vehicles is certainly helping the problem, and it's spreading to electric 2- and 3-wheelers in the global south. This is all good news. But why Norway ahead by 10 years ahead of the rest of the world here? Interestingly, to do with social activists, and ones who are quite famous to people of my generation. Anybody else recognize the members of the pop band a-ha here, including Morten Harket? But you probably don't know this guy. This is Harald Rosvik, an architecture professor in Stavanger in Norway, a big friend of Morten Harket's. And there's also Frederick Haug, an environmentalist. These guys, these two in particular, are great friends, both environmentalists at heart. And they're photographed here in 1989. They've gone to the annual solar car races. They're in Switzerland that year. This is a hobby-converted electric vehicle behind them. We'd call it a Fiat Panda. They've gone there because they're on a mission to lobby, if you like, the Norwegian government to incentivize the adoption of electric vehicles. And they're doing that. They've got 9 different policy demands, including waiving the import registration tax on all electric vehicles, waiving the VAT, free parking, free ferry rides, you name it. Anyway, they're doing this because they're embarrassed by their Prime Minister, Gro Harlem Brundtland, who's preaching sustainable development to the rest of the world whilst increasing the extraction and exporting of oil and gas from Norway. They see that as hypocrisy, and they note that Norway already had nearly 100% renewable energy at the time, hydropower, and a really good, strong grid connections, and they could see all the potential for electrifying mobility and the rest. They also were passionate about solar power. Anyway, long story short, they are successful in campaigning. The media follows this pot band everywhere, so they raise awareness of this alternative. They then import one of these cars, a white one, the next year, and they get one of their 9 policy demands, the waiving of the import registration tax, waived. They fight for 7 years to get road tolls waived and some of the other demands. Great entertaining story, which I won't continue to regale you with, but you get the point that, this was social activists who had a vision who ultimately caused the government to come round to that vision, to put in place a load of supportive policies that are the root of the explanation for the tipping point we saw being ahead of everybody else. Because by 2012, it cost you the same amount to own an electric car in Norway as it did a petrol or diesel car, and you saw the market tipped at that point. Right. It's also true that the more batteries we make for electric vehicles, the cheaper they get. And that's what this graph is about. And that's a really powerful reinforcing feedback. Anyway, there's a broader story. Norway illustrates that, to begin with, you're going to need to give it some policy support, but you can bring forward the tipping point, in this case, to electric vehicles. But the more batteries and electric vehicles that get made and bought, the cheaper and the better they're going to get. to the point where eventually it's going to become self-propelling. And crucially, it's going to be generating ever cheaper batteries, which is useful for other tipping points. I mean, first of all, we're concerned with tipping away from the petrol and the diesel cars. But then when you've got cheap batteries, you can tip freight transport on the roads, trucks, basically, electrify trucking. Well, that's another 4 or 5% of greenhouse gas emissions. But also, when you see that this is becoming a tipping point and it's self-propelling, you realize, oh, there's a load of oil that many oil companies thought they were going to be able to sell to fuel the cars in the future that's now a stranded asset. And some oil companies will be having to think about redefining themselves or becoming something else because there's not going to be a market for quite a lot of the oil that's in the ground. And then most crucially, cheap batteries are a key enabler for the bigger tipping point, which is the one to renewable energy. Right now, sadly, on a global average, the electricity powering activity is still, the way that's generated, still responsible for about 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions. But we obviously know that we've got the potential to go to zero emission renewable power. But crucially, when you want to use electricity, like I would say when you want to boil the kettle to make a cup of tea, isn't always when the wind's blowing or the sun's shining. So you need some cheap way of storing electricity in your 100% renewable energy future. And cheap batteries are going to be the most important way to do that. And they're coming out of the mobility sector, where there's a greater demand for batteries, and coming to help us in the transition to renewables. I just want to show you something about the electricity transformation from my side of the North Sea. This is the data from the UK, where the black line, coal burning, at the peak here in 2012 is 40% of the UK's electricity supply, 40%, and it fell off a cliff in a space of just a few years, which I think is pretty remarkable. None of my country people really know about this because nobody ever thinks about where their electricity is coming from. What triggered that tipping point? Well, partly it's the fact that there was this underlying growth of renewable energy, and once you've installed renewables, it generates for free, so you're going to use that electricity first before anything else. But it just took a modest price on carbon emissions levied specifically in the power sector with the promise that it was only ever going to be stepped up. We call it a floor price, just like the floor here, raising the floor. That was enough to basically tip the economics of away from coal burning. So all the people who were invested their money in coal burning started losing money, and then they pulled their money out, which caused the other people who were invested to want to pull their money out faster, and you get like a herd mentality, and boom, you can see what happens. Well, then the utility companies are left with these power stations doing nothing, and then eventually they get around to destroying them because they're costly if you just leave them idle. So this is the destruction of a coal-burning power station in Oxfordshire, quite kind of dramatic, if you like. But this is, like all tipping points, very hard to reverse once you've destroyed the asset. So hopefully coal power, good riddance. In the bigger picture, though, it's about the renewables, and it's about the fact, as this graph shows, this is solar panels, the more solar panels we make, the cheaper they get to make, and the better they get. So on the x-axis, it's the total global installation of solar power. The y-axis is the price. I logged the scales, but basically, every time we've doubled the number of solar panels installed, the price has come down by about 1/4. But it just kept on coming down by 1/4, and it keeps on coming down. So we had a decade in the data there where it falls by about a factor of 10. And now solar power is the cheapest form of electricity in most of the world. Wind power in a few places around the North Sea, like the UK. Wind power also getting cheaper the more we deploy it. This is fantastic news. We've got the cheapest electricity ever now coming from renewables, because fossil fuel electricity has been a stable price for about a century, give or take a few wobbles. So this is an energy, in a good way, an electricity revolution. This is my colleague Femke Neisser, Dutch colleague, plotting out from a state-of-the-art model, well, what's the cheapest source of power in different countries over time? And you're seeing the maps turn that kind of salmon pinky red for solar, because solar is getting cheaper even faster than wind is getting cheaper. So it's going to dominate on price alone. All right, I'm going to wrap the first bit up now. I got a tiny bit about how I told you the batteries are going in to reinforce the renewables transformation. I could tell you equally, ever cheaper electricity is the incentive to electrify everything, not just our cars or our mobility, but heat pumps for our homes, the trucks, blah, blah, blah. The last bit I had, we model this stuff. We can show not only these tipping points in different sectors of the economy reinforcing each other, but this will measurably bring forward the transformation we need. So remember I started with the worst news in the climate was if the bad tipping points start to reinforce each other and you have like a bad cascade. Well, the good news in the economy is the positive tipping points actually can measurably reinforce each other and trigger what I'd call a positive tipping cascade. That's what we need. What this graph would also, if we had time to go through it, also would tell you is there's a particular policy that's more effective than anything else, and that is to mandate the phase in of the new clean technology and the phase out of the old fossil technology. So in simple terms, you're not going to be able to sell a petrol diesel car in our market after 2035. It's a very effective policy to activate the amplifying feedbacks that tip the chair, but this time in the good direction to this new clean green economy. All right, so where I'm going with this, we should start to feel a sense of agency here because we're all consumers. Many of us got pension funds and we have a say in where those are invested. So we don't actually have to go on hunger strike like Lillian and put our lives on the line, although I salute the people who do. The point is, some of the stories I've told you and others I could tell you indicate transformative change is already starting to happen, and it's a weird, interesting mix of social activists, technology innovators, policy support, the bottom-up and the top-down coming together that give us some kind of mix of recipes for how this can happen, yeah? Yeah, I'll leave the first part there. My message is we can do it, and I've tried to show you the evidence is there. We're kind of already doing it, but there's ways, if we learn the lessons of recent and more distant history, that we can do it better and sooner and faster. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, like you mentioned, there will be a part 2 where you're going to talk again. But for now, we want to give you the opportunity to ask questions. Probably there are some in the audience. So if you have a question, then please raise your hand. Ah, that's perfect.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh. Thanks so much for sharing this, and it's refreshing to go to something different. I was listening to a podcast about cancel culture and climate, and I feel like there's so much conversations about, like, no, protest this way, no, protest that way. Right. And they were talking about people with soup at museums, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm also probably one of the people that feel like nothing's working. What do you think about that, about people disagreeing on how to get the message across when you feel like nothing is working?
I think we're all maybe in a difficult bind, aren't we? Because we're frustrated. I suppose the message of tipping points is just because you don't see the change that you thought you'd see start to really unfold, stick with it, because that's the message from all of these examples. It doesn't look like anything is happening, like in the Norway car market or the UK electricity, and then suddenly everything happens. And that's the point of the story with feedbacks. It's like there's something is resisting, trying to hold the line of the status quo, and then bang, everything will change. Just like the suffragettes would have, if you read the history, would feel the same frustration. Why is nothing changing? I mean, it won't help any of us if we are divisive amongst ourselves. I'm a pluralist anyway. I think the front is broad and long, if you want to use the military metaphor, and it's fine to have different groups trying different approaches. I just wouldn't. Yeah, for what it's worth, my personal view is let's not argue amongst ourselves. If you look at the civil rights movement, though, we would learn a lot about strategic effectiveness. Particularly in the US, the civil rights movement is a lesson in how you've got to be able to outmaneuver your opponent. So you come up with a new strategy when the incumbents, the government, and the enforcement agency start catching up with your current strategy and working a way to shut it down. You innovate fast enough and you come up with a new strategy, and then they're always trying to keep up with you. That's what the climate movement would do well to to learn, in my humble opinion, if you are an activist.
That's quite an advice. I'll get to you.
Thank you.
Hey.
Thank you so much for the talk. So my question is about what you said, the positive tipping points, and what are the barriers to that and things that keep us in the unstable world. And especially I want to hear your opinion on social inequality and maybe and what is your take on that in terms of climate action, and more specifically about, there's a lot of research in carbon inequality and how like 1% of global earners are responsible for 15% of emissions, similarly like 30 companies for 60% of emissions. So I'm asking what we can do about that and how are they coming into tipping points?
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we should, I think, be highlighting the over-consumers as a target to rightly, what would you say, naming and shaming even, and making it clear that the gross overconsumption is disproportionately contributing to the problem and just can't be justified. That's simple enough. More broadly, though, rising inequality, which is particularly prevalent most prevalent, arguably, in the English-speaking neoliberal countries of my own and the US particularly, in my view, ought to be fueling more social discontent than it is. And the puzzle for me is that we're less visibly exercised than we should be about this rise in inequality. I think that's, I'm not pretending to solve that puzzle, but that's one we're sat with. What history teaches us is when there is gross inequality, and we could take the US as an example, but in this case, rewind to around 1900 again, when it became visible to everybody that there were gross monopolies after the unfolding of the Industrial Revolution in the US. Power was grossly concentrated in the hands of the few, and they were corrupting the political system. And pretty much everybody stood for election on a ticket of sorting the corruption out and breaking the monopolies. And so that was then, what was that known as? The progressive era, right? The 20s, ensuing 20 or 30 years in the US. How ironic to look at the US now, to know that it did that a century and a bit ago. But we need, in my view, we need to, again, look at the lessons of history there, and we need to repeat on that. Okay, it's a bit different. The companies are multinational and globalized, and you're like, oh, can we go after them? We can go after the tech giants who say one thing and do another, and let's not get into the weeds, but they have a gross monopoly at the moment, and the European Union, I salute it in being apparently the only ones at the moment really standing up to try and sort this out, at least sort out some of the gross things that those tech giants are doing and refusing to, police unacceptable content, et cetera, We don't need to go into the details. So, yeah, we need the courage. Of course, any politician needs a popular mandate to feel that they can take on the very powerful. I hope we keep giving them that. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe one last question, and then we're going to move on. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. We have the current situation of a geopolitical big ego fight, or whatever. What if you have endless money, endless lawyers around you? What kind of court case do you start?
To go after those people who seem to have tried to buy their own immunity. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure about a particular individual who's doing their level best to avoid getting locked up, but I do salute the fact that we have an exponentially growing set of court cases against a mixture of governance backsliding on climate targets, but also fossil fuel companies having ruined the earth or the climate for all of us. So that what I'm referring to is the number of cases, mostly civil cases, going to court and being won by that part of the climate movement continues to grow. So we're making some headway. Let's not be completely sort of downhearted about very visible individuals causing a lot of trouble, because at the same time there is a growth of effective use of the law, shall we say, to try to start to right some of the wrongs, although it's got to keep growing. And we'll come round maybe in part 2 to rights of nature as for me another really important way in which the law is developing quite rightly to be you might say a weapon in our armory, as it should be. Yeah, I'd just say with the current craziness, think about that ball rolling around in the valley. If everybody kind of senses, oh wow, the economy and the energy system is kind of destabilizing, it's part of the quality of it is sometimes the ball rolls back in the opposite direction, and it feels like this horrible reactionary force has just got louder and more even more despicable than it used to be. But that could be just, unfortunately, a symptom of a deeper transformation. And it's hard to avoid the conclusion that if we're going through a fundamental transformation of kind of everything in the economy, it's bound to be unstable and disruptive. We're going to have to learn to navigate that.
Thank you, Tim. You can, well, take a break for a while. Enjoy some music like us. Yes. Yeah, to all let this sink in, we invited musicians. Give them also a big applause. Janne Stra and Laurens Radstaken with Water.
Hi. This song works best if you sort of start humming along after the tipping point. There is so much going on. I can't find the words, not even an emoji, for the many ways it hurts. Remind me to be patient. Let the waves roll out. A lot of water in the water, but it will all calm down. I'm working on the story, sorting everything, naming every worry. Then I'll know what to sing. Remind me to be patient. Let the waves roll out. A lot of water in the water, but it will all come down. Wait for the wind, wait for the swell, the current will tell. Wait for the wind, wait for the swell, the rain will tell. Thank you.
En Laurens Radstaken. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I was wondering, yeah, when you heard you were playing here, why did you choose this song, or did you choose it together?
Because it's so optimistic. No, yeah, it's just a way for me to express like the things that I'm dealing with for myself. That might be like something that other people recognize, and on the other hand, also trying to describe everything that's happening in the world, which is a little bit complex. But in the end, it's nice to know that it will all calm down.
All right, we hang on to that.
Yes.
Yeah. I was wondering, when you hear Tim Lenton's story and like about those social tipping points, so much can happen when people act. What role can music play, you think, in it?
Well, of course, you have all these Instagram little videos with these very emotional piano things. I really hate those things. Actually. Like you have this emotional piano thing, but no. Sometimes it works directly when you watch a video that is like accompanied by music that can really touch you, and maybe that's your own personal tipping point that you start acting, or
Yeah, because as a musician, you have so many listeners. You can.
So many.
Yeah, you have. Yeah. Right? So you can, do something, I think.
Well, I think every musician is like responsible, or artist, or everyone who has a platform is very responsible for what they're doing at the moment. Like what you do yourself, like how are you living your life? What exactly is it what you're showing to the world? That's very important, I think.
Yeah. Well, and being here is part of it. Thank you so much. And we, at the end of the evening, you'll be back.
And also the choir will be back.
Ah, okay. Well, that's good to know.
I'm very sorry, but yes, I need you.
All right. Yes, Tim, it was a short break. Are you reloaded? Are you ready to go for part 2?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You're ready? Okay, I'll leave the stage.
Thank you. That was beautiful and very grounding as I try to shift in a slightly different direction into nature and our relationship with it. Something that, for what it's worth, is essential to me and what motivates me in my practice and my efforts. So yes, positive tipping points for nature, brackets, Gaia. I'll come to what Gaia is if you've never heard of Gaia. Before the break, it was all about energy, and it seemed maybe techie stuff, and it's true that energy system, that's sort of 3/4 of our greenhouse gas emissions, but there's another quarter that's really to do with how we eat and how we farm to provide the diets that we've chosen. And of course, it's farming and our dietary choices that are the major driver at the moment of net destruction of nature. Something that it won't surprise you to know has been going on systematically for some time now. I don't know how familiar you are, though, with the fact that most of our governments have signed up to an agenda to reverse the long-term decline and loss of nature, turn it round, be in a state by 2030, so 5 years' time, of net recovery of nature, and then try to somehow get back the nature we've lost within a generation by 2050. Did you know that we were all signed up to that nature positive agenda? I like that. I'm good with the ambition, but once again, that's a spectacular rate of change that's required from manifestly doing the wrong thing and sending things in the wrong direction to trying to get our life support system, is what I'll refer to it, back in a healthier state. But clearly, the same concept underneath here, we're going fundamentally in the wrong direction. It's unsustainable. There could be an imagined alternative state, including of stuff we'll get back to, dietary choices and the food and farming system. But we would have to do something. There are many vested interests in the status quo. We can come back to some of that, but there's a massive lobbying from the meat sector and industry, for example, to keep us all on average. I don't mean to point the finger at anybody, but the average person, certainly in a richer country and globally, is over-consuming meat protein. It's bad for their health and so on and so forth. That was just one part of the puzzle here, because what I want to talk about is more how to take this idea of positive tipping points into how we think about changing our relationship with nature. And the great thing about nature is it was there before we were, and it's full of its own feedback loops, right? And this gets demonstrated when people, like we do, interfere in nature. So a famous example is at some point somebody shot the last wolf in Yellowstone National Park, and it didn't just eliminate the wolves, it changed the whole ecosystem. The elk, who were no longer getting eaten by the wolves, population went crazy. The elk ate down all the little saplings of the trees they like to eat. So the whole landscape, the forest cover dropped precipitously. Everything changed in simple terms. Many decades later, the conservationists won the fight to put the wolves back into Yellowstone National Park, and it, again, tipped the whole ecosystem. The point here I want to make, though, is we don't really think about the feedbacks in nature and how we could work with them in a good way. We're barely even aware of it. I think we just clumsily bumble along and kind of make a mess in nature generally. But we could, you know, the royal we, some ecologists, know a lot about this stuff. And if we were smart, we would see that we have the potential to, in many ecosystems, tip them back into a better state, just like reintroducing the wolves in Yellowstone National Park. So at the level of the ecosystem, there are often tipping points. We often think about the bad ones where we made things worse, but examples like this show we can tip things for the better. That also extends to where we're entwined with nature to the point that maybe we're fishing the coral reef for our fish, some of our fish supply, or any number of different farming systems. And academics, they come up with fancy terminology. They talk about these as social ecological systems where kind of people and nature are intertwined just to get the things we need from nature, certainly a food supply, but often other fibers, things like this. The point I want to make here, though, is, yeah, there's many cases where bad tipping has happened, like we've overfished and we've caused the fish stocks in the Baltic Sea to crash or whatever. But interestingly, there's an archive, and I'm showing you a 20-year-old website here, of over 100 case studies of where there's been a positive tipping point, where people realized, oh God, things have gone really badly for us and the ecosystem that we work and live with. But they found a way to tip it back into a better state. So that's what this Eco Tipping Points project is about. I'll just give you one example that as many I could have chosen. So this comes from the drier northern part of India, Rajasthan, monsoonal climate. So when it does rain with the monsoon, you want to capture that water. And traditionally, what people did would be dig out artificial reservoirs like this one in the language called a johad. That would catch the monsoon rains, that would then infiltrate down in dry season, keep the aquifer water levels up, allow thus the trees to green the landscape and provide water crucially for wells where you could irrigate your crops in the dry season, and that's how you sustained yourself as a community. And there was a communal governance system around managing this common pool water resource and so on and so forth. Things had gone bad after independence. In this particular part of Rajasthan, there was a lot of deforestation of the hillsides. The silt washed down off the hillsides. It filled these artificial reservoirs with silt, so they no longer functioned. Well drilling technology was getting better at the time. So what first happened was people just tried to dig the wells deeper with better and better technology. That strategy fails at some point when the water table is dropping. Then there was a catastrophe. Basically, they couldn't farm anymore. The men left for the cities. Women and the children are left having to walk miles for water. A catastrophe, ecologically and socially. But at some point, a well-meaning NGO turned up in one of these villages where the disaster had happened, with some idea that they were going to build, I can't remember whether it was a school or a health centre, but the local elders just took them aside and immediately said, that's not what we need the water back. Got any ideas? They had a conversation, they realised, well, why don't we go back to the old practice? Why don't we dig out one of these reservoirs that's filled with silt, which they duly did. The monsoon rains came, the neighbouring wells filled up. So the next year they dug out another 8. And then this initiative not only replenished the wells there and rejuvenated farming, and then the men came back from the cities and the community reinstated its old style of governing water, but the initiative also spread out. It's spread not just across Rajasthan now and across India, it's spread to monsoonal climates in West Africa. It's positive tipping both localized, but also, as I've just hinted, there's something else going on. Sometimes when we find a solution that in itself was self-propelling, that idea or that way of doing things differently can spread through society. Now that's something that's widely observed actually for all kinds of innovations. There's in fact a famous textbook written about how innovations diffuse through society. My point here would be there are other really valuable opportunities and lessons of this kind of social ecological rejuvenation that have spread, you might say like wildfire, but we don't always think of wildfire as a good thing. So here's one more example that I've worked with, this initiative, of a kind of positive tipping initiative that's also got its own tipping point of spread. So we're now, we've switched geography. These are a bunch of smallholder farmers. As you can see, most of the leaders here are women, and this is a part of Kenya, around Mount Kenya there, the volcano, the extinct volcano. This initiative's actually started in Tanzania and has spread across Kenya, Uganda. And it came out of listening to the people in a bad situation where they'd lost a lot of forest cover, there was a lot of erosion, the crops were failing, there were bigger problems in the community with the HIV/AIDS epidemic in East Africa. There was also the issues with really poor cooking arrangements and the opportunity for some other positives like introduce clean cook stoves, HIV/AIDS education. But the people together, they came together, they realized we need the trees back, in simple terms. That would make our lives better and give us the soil back. So this is what we'd call an agro-forestry initiative among smallholder farmers in East Africa, where they essentially have an incentive to plant trees on their land. They'll get a little bit of payment for carbon credits because this initiative set up a system where they themselves could monitor that the tree was growing, and they could report that, they would get the payment. But it's a much more of a systems view initiative. It's not just about carbon credits, it's about the fact that the whole initiative, you can see the complicated name, I'll just call it TIST, is about empowering the people, and in particular female leaders, to lead the initiative. It's based around 4 or 6 smallholder farmers will form a group, but then they'll work together with other groups, and maybe 8 of these groups to form a cluster to have their own little tree sapling nursery to raise the trees that they're going to plant on the land, and so on and so on. Well, I'll just show you a video of how this particular tree planting social change initiative has spread around the lower slopes of Mount Kenya and up into the tea growing regions through this particular part of Kenya. I could again have shown you a video of its wider spread, but it spread partly through that social contagion I talked about before the break, because it was empowering the people involved in it. But it's not just benefiting the people, it is benefiting nature, and not just interestingly in the simplest terms of we're adding some trees back to a deforested landscape. We'll come to that. It's a very bland graph. It shows that you saw an early growth in that video, and right at the end you were seeing a new phase of really steep growth that's continued. Things don't always, things stall sometimes. This happened to be about limitations of the technology that was holding back this growth that wanted to happen in this good initiative. But anyway, Anthony, one of our students, is busy mapping out all the amplifying feedbacks in this system that can explain how it's self-propelling. We don't need to worry about the detail, it's the principle. Here's an example, and there are many of conservation initiatives or resource management that is spreading. Marine protected areas in the ocean would be another example. And this particular one is doing something more subtle. I know this looks a bit technical. This was just one of the areas around Mount Kenya. The blue are all the little small holdings that those farmers, that's their home, that's their little bit of land. But the greens and the browns show you looking from a satellite whether this part of the landscape is getting greener or getting browner, getting better or worse in simple terms. And you can probably see by eye that there's some kind of association between where the farmers are planting trees on their land and where it's getting greener. In fact, we showed that the greening of the surrounding landscape is sort of spreading out from the places where the tree planting is happening, probably because people are raiding the neighboring landscape less for firewood. There's also some ways in which trees will support a moister climate that will help other trees in simple terms. And that means the actual effect of this initiative is way bigger than what you just measure in the plots themselves. So there's an amplifying feedback again. Now, you might think, so that's how positive tipping points for nature can spread through social tipping mechanisms. I wanted to go upscale to something big that everybody recognizes, the Amazon rainforest. This is actually showing that we can see from satellite that in the last 20 years, sadly, we've seen the Amazon rainforest get, I would say, less stable is a simple way of describing it, less resilient to shocks like the droughts that are hitting it harder. But I wanted to talk about the Amazon as well, because I told you before, this is an amazing system that's at risk of being tipped into a bad state. It was on my maps previously, because we know if you take the forest away, it wouldn't regrow. You'd have an alternative stable state, just like the chair. And the forest does lots of things to maintain itself. It suppresses fires locally by keeping a moist climate, but it also recycles the rainfall that falls on it back to the atmosphere, that then passes through the atmosphere and helps it rain somewhere else downwind, and then recycles again and it rains more downwind, and so on. In that way, the forest is, you could say, self-sustaining. Of course, people are busy destroying it, as well as perhaps the climate signal causing it to lose stability. They've destroyed the forest most down here. But if we were smart, in principle, we could work with those feedbacks, and we would know something about the best way to reintroduce trees, if you like, in simple terms, to trigger the trees, to trigger the further spread of other trees by suppressing the fires, by recycling more moisture. So that would be great, wouldn't it? You know, let's regrow the Amazon instead of destroying it. But in this narrative, it makes no sense to not talk about, well, why are we still destroying it? You know, we can't even begin to think about being nature positive, even if my argument's right that it's possible to tip nature back to a better state. You're going to have to tackle the things that are destroying nature and have been destroying nature for decades. So that has to take us back to overconsumption. Where was the question from earlier? You know, and consumption patterns. And I've told you once already that the biggest driver of nature loss is that on average, the average person on the planet is eating more meat in their diet, and eating meat is a really an efficient way to feed yourself in terms of land. And beef is the worst thing possible in that sense. But in some rich nations, including the UK, and I'm afraid I don't have the figures for the Netherlands, we're actually eating less meat, and systematically it's declining. So, okay, let's not get into the technicalities of the possibility of a tipping point in dietary norms, but I think if you're interested, there's much research and people working on that. What I wanted to say really is that is also a realm, it's a realm of behavior where it is about norms. We're influenced by how our family eat, how our friends eat. There is I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there is the possibility to shift our dietary norms in a way that would put much less pressure on nature, would open up the space to regenerate nature. Great, but then maybe there's a deeper tipping point underneath all of this. That was all kind of quite practical stuff. I tried to go upscale towards like the Amazon, but then there's an even bigger scale. There's the whole biosphere, the whole planet, right? And this is where Gaia comes in. Gaia is the name given to what I'd call a new scientific worldview, that we are part of what some people would describe as a living system, but the combination of life on the planet for 4 billion years has acted on average to create a more stable climate, to create an oxygen-rich atmosphere and things that we absolutely depend on for our lives. And a couple of scientists, a couple of heroes of mine, James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, gave this hypothesis of theirs when they recognized that life was both creating the atmosphere we breathe and stabilizing it. They called it the Gaia hypothesis after the ancient Greek Mother Earth figure, or Earth goddess Gaia. So that's something that people like me have spent almost all their careers working on. Oh, wow, we start to understand that we're just part of this pre-existing, you might say, living system that is fundamental to supporting our life. It gives us a breathable atmosphere, a cooler and more stable climate. It cycles all the elements we need to flourish and the water and so on and everything else. That's a shift in worldview for some of us, because we're still living in a culture that for at least the last 400 years since the so-called scientific revolution has taken the view that nature is just there for basically in service of us, for human emancipation. And you might also observe, if you've read Genesis and the Old Testament, that this is at the root of Abrahamic religions as well, that we have dominion over nature. Well, some of us don't have a different worldview than that. I'm not going to pass judgment on different views, but the point is, this of course connects with many indigenous worldviews that people would say are ecocentric. It's like a scientist finding a new kind of sciencey variant of something that many indigenous societies would say is obvious. But my proposition is it would certainly help things along if we saw that shift in worldview start to permeate a little wider into our culture. And I've talked about Lovelock and how he was the great champion of this. But where I want to go with this Gaia idea just for a minute is to say, okay, great idea, maybe we shift in worldview. What's buried in this worldview is a number of things, but one thing some of us are exploring is if we really took it on board, as Lovelock says there, we'd realize that we're just part of or within something that by which the stable state of our planet includes us just as part or partner in a very democratic entity. And what Lovelock is saying is, hold on a minute, we should really give some political voice to all the other living things that we totally depend on for our life support if we wanted to have a happy and long, prosperous future on this planet. And so I wrote about this with another great friend, Bruno Latour. But what we were wrestling with was what we're all wrestling with, which I sort of drew this crude diagram to try and express, is we're here this evening, I think, because we've got a nagging sense that we're messing up our life support system, be it the climate or the biosphere or whatever you think of it as, and that this is not a good idea and it's not going to end well. And we might have already changed some of our personal actions or behaviors because of that sense of this, things aren't right. I have, I'm sure some of you have. And in doing so, you could say, as I put it there, we're consciously thinking, oh, this isn't right, we need to change what our actions, otherwise the outcome's going to be really bad. So we're using some of our awareness or self-awareness as a new kind of feedback in the Earth system or Gaia, whichever word you prefer. And that's not been there before. I mean, dolphins are very smart, octopuses are super smart, but they're not collectively thinking about their collective effect on the planet in the way that humans are. So this is something new, and that's why we called it our Gaia 2.0. Maybe we could just fumble our way towards bringing a bit of human self-awareness to the Earth's self-regulation. And then immediately, Bruno, who's sadly passed away, but a great philosopher, he immediately was, first of all, lambasting me for the disembodied brain, because it should be a bunch of people chatting about stuff in the bottom. But then he was like, oh yeah, so who's going to, who are the humans playing this for? Who are the privileged few who get to sort of make the decisions here? What sort of consciousness can we expect of ourselves or them? And crucially, the thing I'm interested in is, what is this new science, and you could say old worldview, new old worldview? What might we take from it if we were really intent on a flourishing, sustainable future together? I mean, it might seem crazy to take lessons from 4 billion years of microbes transforming the planet, but I'll just tell you a few basic things that make our world, our life support system tick. First of all, Gaia is comprised of networks of agents, I call them, but living things, mostly microbes. They're fundamentally interconnected. I show an imagery there of some of the, I think that's an imagery of some pathogens in invertebrate species, but I could show you the gut microbiome as this interconnected system, or I could show you there the fungal mycorrhizae that connect to the root system of a little sapling of larch, is it? Yeah, that allow it to live and flourish and make the soil. So the living system that we depend on for our lives is all about networking. It's also about being powered by the sun. It comes in through photosynthesis, right, into the biosphere. But as you saw earlier, for us, hopefully we're about to seize the opportunity to power all of our future societies by the sun. So that would be learning a basic lesson from 4 billion years of flourishing of life on Earth. You've got to be powered by solar energy. And crucially, you then need to recycle all the materials you need to flourish. It's no good having a linear economy where you dig stuff out of the ground, use it once and chuck it away again. That just doesn't cut it. The reason the biosphere flourishes is it recycles all the materials it needs in extraordinary amounts. So without worrying too much about the details over here, these are on a log scale, these are the massive fluxes of gases exchanged by life at the surface of the Earth compared to what would happen without life coming out of volcanoes. We wouldn't be here to talk about it if prior life had not worked out an amazing recycling system that just spins around everything it needs. So our future economy has got to be circular. We have to remake everything we need to enjoy and flourish out of what's already there in the system. Maybe that's stating the obvious, but I'm going to state it. And then how does life, how does it evolve such a system? It's all about exchanging information horizontally. That includes genetic information. So in the world of microbes, there's literally exchange of genes, regular exchange of genetic material. But if you go to a social insect colony, like an ant colony, it's all about collective intelligence emerging from what we call the heterarchy, but by horizontal exchange of information. And any natural system that has a more hierarchical arrangement tends to be less resilient, less robust, and less long-lived. But of course, we've got a few lessons to learn there in our human societies, as we heard in the questions before. But where am I going with this? Well, it's from the bottom up that for 4 billion years, what's mostly been microbial life has managed to extend its influence over space to the point that it's completely reshaped our atmosphere and climate and the surface of the Earth. And it's extended its influence through time to 4 billion years, a number so big we can't even kind of comprehend it. So it's all about bottom-up collectives or networks of agents. And what are we seeing in our movement or in the climate ecological movement? We see loads of examples, like I talked about before the break, of bottom-up initiatives where some of us, or our friends or whoever, get together and start trying to change things in your system. And it could be in your ecosystem, like the examples I gave earlier, or it could be something that feels a bit more like the Transition Towns movement. Let's explore a new form of currency, the local currency, or whatever. I suppose the broader point is, this is bubbling up all the time. I'd like to suggest that maybe we could better learn from all the collective learning we're doing. I like to think of something I'm going to call Gaiapedia, which will be this web resource where trying somehow to think of, like Wikipedia, persuading you all to post what you're doing so that we can learn from each other's mistakes as well as successes. But this is the crux of how change has always happened from the bottom up, and the change that actually gave us a world in which we could evolve and flourish. So I'll finish there on the thought that maybe that's the deepest, there's both the deepest tipping point will be if more of us can grasp that worldview, but also that's like it's a theory of change, essentially, and that's what I've enjoyed myself writing about. If you're curious to read more about the things I've been talking about, there's a book coming out in September. Everyone has a book to plug, but thank you.
Thank you so much. You can, definitely something to chew on, what you just told, and something to look forward to. So thank you very much for so much information. Yeah, you did well. Mentioning bottom-up actions, we have someone here who is actually one of the initiators of this whole series about tipping points. She's a biomedical scientist or immunologist. And she's here to tell us a bit more about... by the way, there's a possibility to ask questions to Tim after her talk as well to her. So then, you know, if you have any questions, there will be a possibility for that. But first of all, give her an applause. Nina Hertogs. Yes.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Yes. Hi, everyone. As Nienke said, I've been part of the organizing team of this series. And it's, oh yeah, thanks. I forgot about this. And it's really thrilling or quite exciting to stand up here on this stage for once. So thanks everybody for coming tonight. Thank you if you've come to the other editions, of course. So we always try to carve out some time for an initiative or an organization that advocates for climate justice or works towards it. And this time we thought it would be really fitting to put a little spotlight on Scientist Rebellion. And I'm very honored to be the person who takes the stage for this. But first I would like to ask you something. So in our activism circles, we have little tools to gauge interest or gauge enthusiasm, and I just want to do a little temperature check. So I would like to see your hands, and there are 3 signals that you can choose from. One is this, which means I'm full of energy, very happy, and yeah, very interested to hear what you want to say. This is moi getting tired, and this is, oh, I can't wait for this to be over. Go. Ah, that's very nice of you, thank you. But don't worry, this will be short anyway. So can I also see some hands for everybody who's been at a climate march in the last years? Ah, this is really great. And who has been to the 812 or a different civil disobedience? Nah, look at that, that's really amazing. I would also want to ask if anybody is brave enough maybe to tell a little bit about how they feel after Tim Lenton's talk, or maybe how you feel after you've attended one of our series. If you want to talk about this in Dutch, that's totally fine, of course. If you feel more comfortable, that is.
It's not, yeah. My name is Liesbeth van Tongeren, and I've been executive director of Greenpeace. I've been in Parliament for the Green Party. And I must say I'm actually at a despondent stage more than anything else. So I came here to, hopefully get some re-energizing information either from Tim or from some of the others. Because, I think my knowledge is way beyond the pain barrier on what is actually happening. So I've held talks like Tim to try and inspire and energize people. But like many of you, you're probably aware of the real figures. It's damn dramatic. And I've been to the A12, I've been to loads of marches for a large part of my life. But I desperately hope that we are still strong enough to battle this, but I'm starting to doubt it. So I'm rather despondent.
Thank you for sharing. And I have to say a lot of this resonates, of course. So maybe one other person who wants to say something very shortly? If not, I can just continue with whatever I prepared. Let me see. So I've been worried about the climate for a very, very long time, but it was always in the background and it was slowly growing. And at some point I watched a movie or a documentary called A Life on Our Planet by David Attenborough. And I won't go into what it shows, but it was really quite scary. And what it told me was that we aren't actually moving in any hopeful direction. Things are not going to be fixed on their own. So then I became quite panicked, and I decided, okay, I want to be more active. I want to join into this disruptive kind of protesting. And then it took me at least, well, more than a year to actually join. But when I did join, this was my first action. So this was 2022, November, and we went to the private jet parking space at Schiphol to make a point about private jets, of course, being crazy polluting. And this is me. I have a selfie in the reflection of a private jet. I thought that was cool. And I just have to say that for me, it made a huge difference becoming active. It was really nice to actually do something with all my fears and anxiety, but also to be part of a community, to be surrounded by like-minded people, not to have to downplay your worries or the things that you're interested in, but actually be free to talk about it and to share ideas and to learn from each other. So that was really great. So I joined Scientist Rebellion, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about Scientist Rebellion, of course. It's not a great picture, but this is us. This is right before we went on to the A12 at some point. This is a little bit after we went on to the A12. This is the glorious reign of the water cannon. And so this is civil disobedience. This is what is the most obvious thing that we do. And civil disobedience, I think most of you know, but it's breaking with the social norms, basically, breaking the rules also to expose a system that you disagree with, but also to create noise, to create attention for something that you think needs a lot more attention. And this is quite an intense form of civil disobedience, but we also have quite benign forms of civil disobedience. So here you can see a paper pasting. I always think this is quite a cute action. You have a summary of a scientific paper and you paste it onto a relevant government building, for instance. This is not even real glue. It doesn't really stick that well either, and you can just rinse it off with water. So it's absolutely non-violent. But on the right you see blindfolding of statues. This is a global action that we still do every month, once every month, in many countries. And this is also civil disobedience. You're not allowed to do this, but obviously nobody ever gets arrested. But this is not all that we do. I think it's really important as scientists that we also engage in public outreach, and I think that's actually a big chunk of what we do. So there's this. It's a very grainy picture, but I wanted to include it in here. This is an IPCC reading marathon at the VU. It's been done at several universities, and recently there was also an edition. But also the public outreach that we do with this series, because this series is co-produced by Scientist Rebellion. And so why do we do this, and why do we do this as scientists? I think it's quite clear that scientists have worked really hard to understand the climate crisis, to explain the climate crisis, to write all these IPCC reports, to talk to politicians, and it's not really worked, at least not at all at the scale that we needed. And so instead of doing everything really nicely and being very precise about the science, we think we need to change tactics, and we're not only writing papers and reports, but we're trying to create a movement from the bottom up. And that is why we think civil disobedience is a really good tactic to actually be a lot louder about the urgency of the crisis. We wouldn't be scientists if we wouldn't also have some scientific backing. You don't actually need to read. This is just an illustration, but one of these or two of these papers actually show that if a group of people have been exposed to some radical protest in their neighborhoods, they report that they're more worried about climate change. And this doesn't seem to matter if these people look favorably upon this protest. In other words, we are loud and we are heard, and it doesn't matter that people don't like us, because, you know, honestly, a lot of people are not a big fan of disruptive protest. But so one of the examples that I want to show you is of a different tactic. So I went to this protest on the 21st of April, 23, in London. And this was organized by Extinction Rebellion, and they wanted to not have a disruptive protest. This was a completely legal protest, and they just wanted to have a lot of people attending. And it worked. It was really great. There were 60,000 people. The whole city center of London was one big colorful XR fest. It was really, really great. We had Carice van Houten even giving a speech there. And I didn't see any coverage of this. I don't think it was in the Dutch news. I don't think it was even on the BBC. So that comes to show that it doesn't really you know, it's not newsworthy if you just have good people saying very nicely, like, hey, we are worried about this. It just doesn't really seem to work. But then if you think about this private jet action that went around the globe, we had a lot of international news coverage of it. And another one is the A12, for instance. I don't think many people knew about fossil fuel subsidies. And even though like I said, I'm aware that most people don't like the A12 blockade, still more than 70% of the Dutch people agree that fossil fuel subsidies need to be removed. So I think this is a win, and I think, at least as Scientists Rebellion, we believe in this tactic. And we also have to understand, and I appreciate your point, we're up against really strong, big forces. Like the people in power don't want the changes that we need. And when I talk about big powers that we're up against, it's large corporations, it's very, very rich people, it's their politician friends. And what they don't want is any government regulation to limit how much they can actually destroy and pollute everything that we love and depend on. And I think it's really important that more people become louder about how they feel. So as we approach the end of this series, next month on the 28th of May, we have our last edition of the Tipping Point series. What I hope that we maybe achieved is to convince everyone here and everybody who has attended to be more engaged and to be more active. And how does that look? Sure, civil disobedience and taking action would be really, really great. You're extremely welcome to join us. We give action trainings. Action trainings teach you how to protest safely, how to de-escalate, know your rights. So you are always welcome to follow an action training. But it's also scary to do that, and it's not for everyone. So we also have a lot of support roles that we need. But even if protesting is not your thing, it would be really great if you could just speak out in support of our protest. So imagine that, okay, your colleague has been in a traffic jam because the A12 was blocked, and they are so angry Monday at work, they're complaining about these a-holes from Extinction Rebellion. Maybe this is the moment where you say, like, yeah, they're annoying, but they're doing this for a good cause, and I actually agree with it, and I'm worried about the climate too. That is at least one of the ways that we hope that you can help us and help all of us reach the positive tipping points that Tim talked about. So thank you. This is my pitch.
Thank you very much. I'm just curious, because I have the feeling like, well, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it was sort of a no-go for a scientist to be also an activist. It was very, split parts. Could you say that there's also some sort of social tipping points in academia, at universities, that it's more, well, allowed to be an activist?
I don't know. I find it difficult. I hear different things. I mean, so we've definitely grown a lot in the last 2 years. So we started with just a handful of people, and now we have more than 500 scientists and academics among us. So I definitely think there is a lot of mobilization, but there are also a lot of people who strongly disagree for scientists to do this. What I want to say is that I think it's an illusion to think that you can be neutral or that you are a disembodied brain like Tim showed, who is just doing science and that's it, because we also have some skin in the game, right? This is our planet, this is our future. You can't expect a scientist not to be emotionally connected. And when of course, it's important that you always make sure that you're not so biased that the way that you look at facts gets changed. But I think we need to be way more worried about people who are actually making money spreading disinformation, and scientists who are being funded by the fossil fuel companies rather than scientists who basically put everything at stake to fight for climate justice. Yeah. Yeah, I hope that that's an answer to your question.
Yeah, it is. Tim, maybe you can join us. I'm wondering, because you also put a lot of effort in spreading, well, the word or your research. You consider yourself as an activist, or?
Well, I had a great moment before he went to jail. I went to Glastonbury Festival. You know what that is in the UK, and you speak,
huge, right?
You speak in the Speakers Forum. It's called, wonderful thing organised by couple of really wonderful people. And I bumped, Roger Hallam was there, who's now in jail, one of the many people banged up in jail for a ludicrous amount of time in the British so-called justice system for even talking about on a Zoom call the possibility of a process. But anyway, before that, I had this lovely moment where I'd done my little bit, and Roger cornered me. He said, he grabbed me and shook my head. He said, "Tim, I got 30,000 recruits in a week from that paper you published." And I was like, fantastic. So I think everybody has their role to play. If I was to level with you, I didn't actually particularly enjoy being at Glastonbury. My idea of hell is being around lots of other people in a confined space, if I'm honest with you. And I'm much happier like running on Dartmoor on my own or with a few friends and communing with the sphagnum moss. So everybody has to know their place in the world and use the skills or the gifts they've been given. And in my case, I try my best, but I totally support the movement. And I hope that if I keep doing what I'm doing, I'm giving the ammunition, if we can use the military metaphor, to effectively.
Yeah, but still it's interesting because you are a climate scientist and then you went almost to, sociologist, and the last part was almost philosophical. That's also a journey you make.
Well, like Nina says, we've all got skin in the game. But I mean, for what it's worth, I showed you those 2 books by Lovelock. I was an 18-year-old kid. I'd worked, we say in English, my arse off to get from comprehensive school into Cambridge University to study what I loved, which was science. And I was really depressed because the only career they could kind of talk about was to become a chemical engineer or something. We know where most of them work, in the fossil fuel refining industry. I was despondent because I felt connected to nature all through my particular upbringing. It's just what I was drawn to. So actually it was reading those 2 books that was like an epiphany for me. That told me that's what I want to research. I set my path. But yeah, I've meandered widely because I was privileged to kind of get engrossed in or immersed in this other view of, I literally feel like it's a different view of reality when I study this stuff in depth, and also when I try and, if you like, commune with nature. And I'll often find myself in a conversation with other people where I think we're talking about the same thing, but I suddenly realize we're in different worlds. And so for me, it's not alien to study anything that's pertinent, just to giving us a way of engaging with the what's otherwise the bewildering complexity of all this change that's unfolding around us. Yeah.
Thank you. Other people with questions in the audience? Yes. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was wondering, thanks both for your very inspiring talks. I was wondering if you see a crucial role for government policy for making this working for the whole of society, like a societal change? Or could it be possible just bottom up and staying within the civil world, to say? And if so, if there's a crucial role for government, do you think in the current geopolitical landscape that chances are smaller or bigger?
Who are you asking?
Yeah, is there someone you're pointing the question to, or you?
Look, I mean, there should be a crucial role for government because it's there to represent the public or the collective good. In a way, that's to state the obvious. But it's obvious probably to everybody in the room that the so-called social contract between us and in forms of representative democracy is not looking strong. And that's opened the door for this kind of toxic populism. But what we need to do then is address, hey, there's other forms of democracy, deliberative democracy, participatory budgeting, there's movements around that. We certainly have to do something to rejuvenate a credible version of democracy. But yes, the whole point of government fundamentally is that it should be there to to support the public good. And no doubt many changes now are depressing all of us because we're seeing failures on that front, but not everywhere. It's worth remembering that.
Yeah, I'd like to add something to that. I mean, obviously, it's really important that, for instance, subsidizing cheap travel or the types of food that you eat, that definitely helps. But I also think it's really important that we understand that as a people, we can also make a difference. And I'm just thinking of this one guy that I've discovered quite recently that I'm quite a fan of, and his name is Gary Stevenson. I think Gary's Economies is his channel, and he is explaining how our living standards are declining because of the accumulation of wealth in individuals like billionaires. And I think at this moment, the populists are mobilizing unhappy people and mostly poorer people by blaming migrants. And if you look at a channel as Gary's Economics, who actually says, no, I can explain to you, it's not the migrants, it's actually the rich people who are stealing all the assets from society, and we need to prevent them to become rich. And if I see something like that, it makes me really hopeful that if you can actually change the public opinion, that will also change the politics. And you can see that your government, for instance, is already trying to get in his good books because they understand that a lot of people will want to see policy that is actually going to help. So I think this is one of those initiatives that makes me really hopeful that we don't have to wait for public opinion to become nice again, right? Because we see this really ugly right-wing wind blowing through our country and I think a lot of the world. So I think it's also important to find our agency there and still try to find the voices that can actually sway public opinion that will then influence politics again. That's just one thing I wanted to add to that.
Thank you. Because of the time, we have one or two more questions.
Yes, a month ago I was on the Zuidas, the big money there. With 2 professors and 400 students analyzed the big 25 AEX stock exchange noted companies in the Netherlands. For every 100 euros, one of the conclusions, 200 euros social and ecological damage. So we end up in a minus. So if we have it transformative and transitions, we need also to get rid of this bad incentives. If it's ruin us in the line, then we need to stop it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah. There's no question connected. That's a statement. Yeah.
There was
an addition.
A Dutch situation, but you can do it also on a large situation. Yeah. And suggesting the 7R ladder from refuse, reduce, and repair, and you can start tomorrow. Everybody can do it. Start tomorrow.
Yeah, it's about the feedback loop. I think I think of it between the top down. If we call government the top down and the bottom up, that we talked a lot about. They can come into alignment. It happens clumsily, like in the Norway story I told sometimes. But the problem is, at some level, also, you could argue some lack of leadership, shall we say, in simple terms, because you've got a generation, or perhaps generations of politicians who are. It's like a feedback loop. They're looking at what do they think the population thinks and think is tolerable and or not. And of course, you get biased by who's shouting the loudest, not necessarily an honest appraisal of this, what can sometimes be the silent majority. So if we know our facts and figures and we've looked at the survey results, we'd be cheered up to know that worldwide 80% of people think that there's basically a climate emergency and governments should be acting decisively, much more decisively, to accelerate action on it. But our elected leaders are not apparently the ones who are hearing that relatively quiet majority and acting on it. So maybe we need to be louder, but we certainly need to, again, I'm a scientist, so I would quote facts from survey data, but they're pretty heartening if you go and look at them. Yeah.
Last question.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful talks. I wanted to ask Nina, you already mentioned how when you have a nice protest, it's hardly mentioned. If you could say something about what you think of how the media is criminalizing and villainizing the activists, and and painting a totally different story than probably what you experience when you are actually in a protest, and how to deal with that.
Yeah, I have to say it's a bit of a mixed bag. Sometimes I see things, I read things that I know are not true or are misrepresented. I also think sometimes the NOS does a good job because they actually have a few quotes from an XR person there. So it depends on the media, I think. Yeah, it would be really nice if the media would also view their role as a little bit more of an active actor. Because at this moment, and I think we saw this during the pandemic as well, that people in the media can be just really quite sheepish. Like, oh, we have a person who's pro-vaccines, and this is a scientist who knows everything about it. And we have like an idiot at the same table who's like, I disagree. And they view it, you know, what is this called again? The false balance, false equivalence. Thank you. So yeah, I think it would be really nice if people in the media would also realize that climate change is a really urgent issue, right? And very often we, you know, on the NOS, it's another, yes, same source, but you have a really alarming message about the climate, and it's like way down. It's somewhere with some random fact, right? So I definitely think that the media can take more of a role in amplifying the urgency of the crisis. Criminalizing protesters, I feel like that's a thing that is happening a lot, also in our government. So that is another reason why it's really important for everybody who's not a protester themselves, but actually agrees with the point of it, that they speak out in support, I think.
I actually had the last question, but I have some signs here. That's you want to ask an addition, but please a little bit short.
Yes. I'm an entrepreneur. And what I lack in the discussion here in the audience is the positive tilting towards hope. I hear a lot of complaining. So where's the positivism?
You mean in the audience or in the whole story?
Yeah.
Well, I think there's a lot to worry about, but we try to focus on hope. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I could say more and more about the entrepreneurs who created in the first place you could call them just the technologies, but it's the solar panels, the battery technology, the advances that are going on all the time are driven, as they pretty much always have been, by entrepreneurship. That some people are incentivized in various different ways, reputationally and otherwise, maybe just driven to innovate. And we are certainly going to have to do a hell of a lot of innovating to get ourselves out of trouble. So we have to give those people who have that special calling, pat them on the back and give them a recognition in this, because it's crucial.
In your story.
Yeah, I certainly do in the book. Yeah.
I try to include more entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I could have drawn.
Everybody has its own contribution.
I could certainly have drawn that out more, but rest assured, I'm totally with you on that, because we wouldn't have it without public money either. The basic, simple story is it's overwhelmingly the taxpayers' money that funds the research and development that's ultimately given us these the clean technologies we need. So it's a really interesting mix.
Oh. So last edition.
Yeah, maybe it's a very nice parallel to this, because I was thinking of more of the side effects of the transition and putting on the decolonial lens. And how a lot of the innovations are also displacing the gains we're having right here into other places, like in the lithium mining and the rare mineral conflict in Sudan. I'm just curious to hear your view on that, especially taking the electric cars as the big example of a positive in the transition.
Well, yeah, like every new thing we do, we need to consider, is it creating new harms? And if we had good governance, we would always try to minimize the new harms we're creating. But I always think about the scales of justice. I mean, without over-laboring the point, there are millions, and they're rapidly becoming billions of people directly harmed by climate change. And we've got to alleviate that massive amount of harm. We shouldn't gratuitously create additional harms in so doing. But when you weigh the scales of it's important to keep the scales of justice in mind, and to remember that there is innovation, there's in electric 2- and 3-wheelers, entrepreneurship, say, in like I could name you straight off the bat 5 two-wheeler EV startup companies in different bits of East Africa that are generating homegrown green growth in the nation, in the continent that should be the continent of this century, Africa. At the same time, if you think about the balance of trade, at the moment, overwhelmingly, 80% of the world's population live in a net fossil fuel importing country, and that's basically a drain on our capital, or whatever you want to think of it as. You switch to renewables, a lot of it generated in country, you're immediately improving the balance of trade, particularly for the poorest people and some of the poorest countries in the world. So yeah, we don't want to create these particular harms, but all good thinkers as well in the global south and the majority world who've looked at the bigger picture are seeing the enormous positives for the majority world in the transformation and seizing it, and so they should.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Nina. Thank you very much. All right. And we're going to end this evening with Janne Schra again and her guitarist playing the song Speak Up.
Are you still into it? Yeah? Okay. Apologize, compromise, stand in line, you're just fine. Not hungry, oh, you might allow yourself to speak up, speak up. You're in control, staying small, know it's right, black or white. Simple dress is not too tight. Oh, you don't speak up, speak up. Don't hide your mouth behind your hand. Say it now. You're allowed, I'm waiting. Don't pretend you know it all. I'm waiting. Don't be scared to fall. Have the size, analyze, watch the fight, stay up all night, close the door, pace the floor. Oh, you don't speak up, speak up. Don't hide your mouth behind your hand. Say it now. You're allowed, I'm waiting. Don't pretend you know it all. I'm waiting. Don't be scared to fall. Hey, 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 Don't hide your mouth behind your hand. Say it now. You're allowed, I'm waiting. Don't pretend you know it all. I'm waiting. Don't be scared to fall. I'm waiting. I don't pretend I know it all. I'm waiting to not be scared at all. Laurens.
Heel Staken en Janne Schra, dank jullie wel. Thank you very much. Don't be scared, speak up. That's a really nice ending of this evening. Thanks very much for your contribution, for all your questions and remarks as well. But mostly, thanks to you, Nina, and you, Tim. Thanks so much for being here. I hope you enjoy your time in the Netherlands. Like Nina mentioned, the next evening in this series on tipping points is the 28th of May, so keep an eye on our website. Also, all the previous evenings you can watch at dezwijger.nl. You'll find them over there. And I wish you a very good evening and a safe journey homewards.